The dangerous ones never ask for help. Their eyes do. The subway station was supposed to close at midnight, but the storm flooding half of Manhattan had delayed everything. Rain hammered against the cracked glass overhead hard enough to sound like applause from an angry crowd. I sat alone on the freezing metal bench, hugging my coat tighter around my body while stale coffee cooled between my hands. My shift at the community trauma center had ended 3 hours ago, but the trains kept getting delayed. Somewhere above us, thunder rolled through the city like distant explosions. The fluorescent lights flickered once. Twice. Then the station fell silent again except for the rain. That was when I heard footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Uneven. I looked up expecting another exhausted commuter. Instead, a man in a black wool coat staggered through the emergency gate like he'd walked straight out of a nightmare. Tall. Broad shoulders. Dark hair soaked from the storm. One hand pressed tightly against his ribs beneath the coat, while the other gripped the railing hard enough for his knuckles to pale. Even from 30 feet away, I could feel it. Power. The kind that changes the temperature in a room. He looked up slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. Ice blue eyes. Cold enough to freeze an ocean. But underneath that coldness was something worse. Exhaustion. The kind that sinks into a person's bones after too many years surviving things nobody should survive. Then more footsteps echoed through the station. 4 men in dark suits rushed down the stairs behind him. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Every survival instinct inside me screamed that these weren't businessmen. They moved too carefully. Watched too much. One of them grabbed another man by the arm and shoved him forward hard enough that he nearly collapsed onto the wet concrete floor. "Please," the stranger stammered. "I already explained." "You lied," one of the suited men interrupted coldly. The tall man in black said nothing at first. He just stood there breathing slowly while rainwater dripped from his coat onto the platform. Then he stepped closer to the trembling man. Calm. Controlled. Somehow that made him more terrifying. "I gave you my trust," he said quietly. "And you sold information that put people in danger." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The entire station felt smaller around him. The trembling man kept apologizing, words falling over themselves in panic, but the tall stranger barely reacted. He looked tired more than angry, like betrayal had become another routine inconvenience in a life already overflowing with them. Then his eyes shifted toward me. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. The suited men turned too, suddenly aware there was a witness sitting 20 feet away clutching a paper coffee cup with shaking hands. One guard instinctively stepped toward me. The tall man lifted a finger slightly. The guard stopped immediately. That tiny gesture told me everything about who he was. Authority lived in his bloodstream. He studied me carefully. My soaked sneakers. My thrift store coat. The ID badge still hanging from my neck from the trauma center downtown. His gaze lingered there. Therapist. He took another slow step toward me. "You should be terrified of me," he said softly. I should have been. Any sane woman would have been. But as he stood under the flickering station lights, I noticed something nobody else seemed to see. His hand was trembling slightly against his ribs. Not from weakness. From pain he was trying desperately to hide. Emotional pain looked familiar on people. I spent all day around it. I swallowed hard and heard myself whisper before my brain could stop me. "I think you're the one who's hurting." The entire station went silent. One of the guards actually looked shocked. The tall stranger froze completely. And for the first time since he walked into that station, the dangerous man in front of me looked human. There is something deeply unsettling about a man who looks at you like he has forgotten what kindness feels like. Nobody moved after I said those words. The guards stared at me like I had just stepped in front of a moving train without realizing it. The tall stranger stood frozen beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, rainwater dripping slowly from the edge of his coat onto the concrete floor. Up close, he looked even more exhausted. Not physically. Soul-deep exhausted. The kind that sleep could never fix. His jaw tightened slightly as if my words had landed somewhere dangerous inside him. Then one of the men beside him cleared his throat carefully. "Damien," he said in a low, warning voice. Damien. The name fit him perfectly. Sharp.
Heavy.
Controlled. The stranger finally looked away from me and back toward the trembling man near the wall. For a second, I thought something terrible was about to happen. Instead, Damien spoke quietly without raising his voice. "Get him out of here." The relief on the other man's face nearly made my knees weak. 2 guards quickly escorted him toward the stairs while the storm outside continued rattling the glass overhead. Damien stayed exactly where he was, watching me. "You work at the trauma center downtown," he said after a long silence, his eyes flicking briefly toward the badge hanging around my neck. It was not a question. Yes. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. "Art therapy." One corner of his mouth twitched slightly, like he almost remembered how to smile. "Almost. You help people talk about pain for a living." "Sometimes." "And what makes you think you understand mine?" I should have looked away. I should have apologized and minded my own business like every survival instinct was begging me to do. But there was something about the way he asked that question. Not angry. Not mocking. Curious. Like he genuinely wanted to know. I tightened my grip around the cold coffee cup between my hands. Because people who enjoy power do not look tired all the time. Silence stretched between us again. Somewhere down the tracks, a delayed train screeched through the tunnel without stopping. Wind rushed through the station hard enough to send loose paper skidding across the floor. Damien looked down briefly, pressing his hand tighter against his ribs beneath the black coat. The movement was subtle, but I caught the wince he tried to hide. "You are injured," I said quietly. One of the guards immediately stepped forward. "He does not need." Damien lifted a hand slightly without taking his eyes off me. The guard stopped talking instantly. Again, that terrifying obedience. I had seen authority before. Doctors. Politicians. Wealthy donors. But this was different. These men would have followed Damien into fire without hesitation. And somehow that made the loneliness in his eyes even sadder. "You should leave this station," one guard warned me carefully. Now. He was trying to protect me. I realized that suddenly. Not threaten me. Protect me from whatever world this man belonged to. But before I could stand, Damien took another slow step closer. Close enough now that I could smell rain, expensive cologne, and something metallic hidden underneath. His pale blue eyes searched my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why are you not afraid?" he asked softly. The honest answer rose before I could stop it. "Because you looked at me like you wanted someone to notice you were falling apart." For the first time since he walked into that station, Damien Moretti looked completely speechless. Then his phone buzzed sharply inside his coat. The expression on his face changed instantly. Every wall slammed back into place. Cold. Controlled. Dangerous. He glanced at the screen once before sliding the phone away. "The train is not coming tonight," he said calmly. The storm flooded the downtown tunnels. My stomach dropped. "What?" One of the guards was already moving toward the stairs. "We will drive her home." I immediately shook my head. "No. That is really not necessary." Damien kept watching me with that unreadable expression. "Clara," he said quietly, somehow already knowing my name. "You should not be alone tonight." The fact that he knew my name when I had never given it to him made the cold station suddenly feel much colder. The scariest thing about powerful men is how easily they learn everything about you. My stomach tightened the second Damien said my name. I had never told him. Not in the station. Not anywhere. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the glass ceiling while cold wind rushed through the underground platform hard enough to make my hair whip across my face. One of the guards had already disappeared up the stairs, probably preparing the car waiting somewhere outside in the storm. I stood slowly from the metal bench, trying not to let panic show on my face. How do you know my name?" Damien did not answer immediately. He looked exhausted again suddenly, like even standing upright required effort. "Your identification badge," he said quietly after a moment. "Clara Bennett." I looked down instinctively. The badge had flipped backward against my coat sometime during the chaos. Relief should have come. Instead, embarrassment flushed warm across my face. I hated that he had noticed something so small. Damien noticed everything. That much was obvious now. "You should still not be alone tonight," he continued calmly. "The streets downtown are flooding." I can call a rideshare. One of the guards near the stairs actually laughed softly under his breath before quickly going silent when Damien glanced his way. No drivers are accepting requests in this weather, Damien said. And your apartment is in Brooklyn. My pulse stumbled. How do you know that? This time, he looked almost annoyed with himself, like he had revealed too much accidentally. You have a monthly Metro card in your coat pocket, he replied smoothly. Brooklyn zip code sticker. I stared at him. He was lying. Not completely, but partially. And somehow that was worse because it meant he wanted me calm enough to stop asking questions. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered again. Somewhere above us, thunder shook the station hard enough to vibrate through the metal tracks beneath my feet. Damien pressed his hand briefly against his side again, hiding another wince behind that cold expression. I noticed. Of course I noticed. Trauma therapists become experts at observing pain people try to conceal. You should probably go to a hospital, I said carefully. One of the guards immediately stiffened like I had insulted him somehow. Damien only looked amused for the first time all night. Not happy. Just surprised. You think hospitals help men like me? The question carried something bitter underneath it. Something old. Before I could answer, headlights suddenly swept across the station entrance above. A black SUV pulled up outside, barely visible through sheets of rain. One guard touched his earpiece. Vehicle is ready. Damien nodded once. Then his attention shifted back to me. Come on, Clara. Hearing my name in his voice did something strange to my heartbeat.
Calm. Deep.
Controlled. Like he was used to giving orders and being obeyed instantly. I should have refused. Every logical thought in my head warned me not to get inside a luxury SUV with a mysterious man surrounded by bodyguards at nearly 1 a.m. during a thunderstorm. But another part of me remembered the way his hand shook, the exhaustion in his eyes, the sadness hiding underneath all that control. Dangerous people usually enjoyed making others afraid. Damien looked like fear had been following him for years. We climbed the station stairs together while rain crashed sideways through the city streets. The storm had turned Manhattan into a blur of flashing lights, flooded intersections, and screaming ambulance sirens somewhere in the distance. One guard held an umbrella over Damien immediately. Nobody offered one to me. Before I could react, Damien reached over silently and tilted the umbrella toward my side instead, leaving his own shoulder exposed to the rain. The gesture was small, automatic, human, and somehow more confusing than anything else that had happened tonight. The SUV door opened beside us. Warm air spilled out from inside, carrying the scent of leather and cedar. I hesitated. Damien noticed instantly. You still think I am the one hurting, he said softly over the rain. So, why are you suddenly afraid now? I opened my mouth to answer him, then froze completely. Because sitting inside the SUV was a little boy no older than 8 years old staring at Damien with terrified green eyes. Children can sense sadness faster than adults can sense danger. The little boy inside the SUV could not have been older than 8. Pale skin, dark curls falling over frightened green eyes that locked onto Damien the second we stepped into the rain. He sat curled against the far side of the leather seat wearing oversized headphones around his neck and clutching a small dinosaur, so tightly its fabric arm was nearly torn loose. The fear in his expression hit me instantly, because I had seen it before, hundreds of times. Children who spent too much time around tension learned how to stay perfectly quiet. Damien stopped moving the second he saw the boy. Something shifted in his face so quickly I almost thought I imagined it. Not softness exactly, but restraint, the kind people use when approaching injured animals. Luca, he said quietly. The boy flinched anyway. My chest tightened painfully. Damien noticed that too. Of course he did. He noticed everything. Rainwater slid slowly down the side of his face while the city lights reflected silver across the wet street behind him. For the first time all night, he looked unsure of himself. You should already be asleep, he told the boy gently. Luca did not answer. He just stared silently at Damien's hand still pressed against his ribs beneath the black coat. One of the guards leaned toward Damien carefully. He refused to leave without seeing you. Damien closed his eyes briefly, like those words physically hurt him. The storm thundered overhead again, shaking the entire block. Luca jumped at the sound immediately, fingers tightening harder around the stuffed dinosaur. Instinct took over before I could stop myself. I crouched slowly beside the open SUV door, careful not to invade the little boy's space too quickly. That storm is pretty loud tonight, huh? Luca's eyes flicked toward me cautiously. Up close, he looked exhausted too. Tiny dark circles beneath his eyes. Shoulders tense like he had forgotten how to relax. Trauma lived in children differently than adults. Adults buried pain. Children carried it everywhere in their bodies. Damien watched silently beside me while rain soaked through the shoulders of his coat. I hate thunder too, I admitted softly. When I was little, I used to count between lightning and thunder because it made me feel like I had control over something.
Luca blinked slowly.
Then, after several long seconds, he whispered so quietly, I barely heard him. Does it work? Damien froze beside me. Completely froze. The little boy had spoken. I looked toward Luca carefully, pretending not to notice the significance of it. Sometimes, I said gently. Mostly it just reminds your brain that you survived the last storm too. Luca stared down at the dinosaur in his lap. I do not like storms. Neither do I. Another silence settled over us. But this one felt different. Softer somehow. I could practically feel Damien staring at me now, but I kept my attention on the little boy instead. Who is she? Luca finally asked without looking up. Before I could answer, Damien spoke quietly from above us. I do not know yet. Something about the honesty in his voice made my heartbeat stumble. One guard opened the passenger door beside me. Miss Bennett, we should leave before the roads close completely. I stood slowly from beside the SUV, brushing rainwater from my sleeves. Luca looked up at me suddenly. Are you coming with us? The question caught me off guard. Before I could answer, Damien looked directly at me under the storm-dark sky. Those pale blue eyes no longer looked cold, just tired, lonely in a way that made something ache deep in my chest. Please, he said quietly. And somehow that single word sounded more vulnerable than every dangerous thing about him combined. Some people become dangerous because nobody ever taught them how to feel safe. I do not know why I got into that SUV. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was Luca's frightened green eyes. Or maybe it was because Damien Moretti had looked at me like that single word nearly cost him something important.
Please.
Nobody that powerful should have sounded so human saying it. The inside of the SUV was warm enough to fog the windows immediately. Soft amber lights glowed against black leather seats while rain streaked across the glass outside in silver rivers. One guard shut the door behind me, sealing out the storm and most of Manhattan with it. Damien slid into the seat across from Luca instead of beside him. Distance. Careful distance. I noticed that instantly. Luca noticed too. The little boy kept clutching the stuffed dinosaur tightly against his chest while watching Damien with cautious eyes. Did you eat dinner? Damien asked quietly. Luca nodded once. Mrs. Romano made soup. And
Luca hesitated.
And grilled cheese. Damien gave the smallest nod like that answer mattered more than anything else happening tonight. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb while thunder rolled across the city skyline outside. Nobody spoke for several blocks. The silence should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt fragile, like everyone inside the vehicle was exhausted in different ways. I sat beside the rain-speckled window pretending not to notice the way Damien occasionally pressed his hand against his side when he thought nobody was looking. He caught me noticing once. Neither of us said anything about it. You work with children? Damien finally asked. His voice remained calm, controlled, but softer now inside the dim SUV lighting. Mostly trauma recovery, I answered carefully. Art therapy. Emotional regulation. Selective mutism sometimes. Luca looked toward me at the last phrase. Damien noticed that immediately too. Selective mutism, he repeated quietly. Children who stop speaking after traumatic experiences? Sometimes adults too. The silence after that answer felt heavier somehow. Damien looked out the rain-covered window toward the city lights passing outside. Reflections moved across his face in shifting gold and silver patterns while thunder echoed somewhere above the skyline. For the first time, I wondered how old he actually was. He carried exhaustion like someone twice his age. Luca has not spoken much since his mother died, Damien said eventually. The words landed softly inside the SUV, but the grief behind them felt enormous. Luca lowered his head immediately toward the dinosaur in his lap. Regret crossed Damien's face the second he noticed. Like he hated himself for bringing up pain the child was trying to escape. "It is okay," I said gently before the silence could harden. Children process grief differently. Sometimes quiet feels safer than words. Damien looked at me then with an expression I could not fully read. Not suspicion anymore. Something closer to disbelief. Like he was unused to people speaking gently around him. Luca shifted slightly beside me after a few minutes. "You really hate thunder?" he asked quietly. I smiled a little. "Very much. Even when you're grown up? Especially when you are grown up." For the first time all night, Luca smiled faintly. Tiny, barely there, but real. I saw Damien notice it instantly across the SUV. The reaction in his face nearly broke my heart. Relief.
Shock.
Hope so sharp it looked painful. The kind of expression someone gets after surviving too long without light. Then the SUV slowed suddenly outside an enormous building overlooking the river.
Glass.
Steel. Private security near the entrance. The kind of place only very rich or very dangerous people lived. Or both. One guard stepped out first into the rain. Damien stayed seated for a moment longer, watching Luca carefully. "Will you stay for tea?" he asked me quietly. The question sounded strangely uncertain coming from a man everyone else obeyed, without hesitation. I should have said no immediately. Instead, I looked toward Luca clutching the dinosaur beside me. Then back at Damien's exhausted blue eyes. And realized something terrifying. I was starting to feel sorry for a man the rest of the city was probably afraid of. Lonely people recognize each other faster than anyone else. The penthouse looked exactly like I expected a man like Damien Moretti to live. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking rain-soaked Manhattan. Black marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the city lights. Expensive art hanging on dark walls that somehow still felt cold despite the soft amber lighting throughout the room. Everything inside screamed wealth, control, precision. And yet the entire place felt strangely empty. Like nobody actually lived there emotionally. Luca disappeared upstairs with a housekeeper after quietly whispering goodnight to Damien. The little boy paused halfway up the staircase and looked back at me once before vanishing around the corner clutching his dinosaur against his chest. Damien watched until Luca was completely out of sight. Only then did his shoulders lower slightly. "Tea?" he asked again, loosening the wet black coat from his shoulders. I nodded quietly. A woman in her 60s appeared from the kitchen almost immediately, carrying a silver tray. Gray hair twisted neatly at the back of her neck. Warm brown eyes. "Miss Bennett," she said kindly. "Chamomile?" "That sounds perfect, thank you." Damien looked mildly surprised by my politeness toward the staff. I noticed because his eyes narrowed thoughtfully before he glanced away again. The older woman smiled faintly at him. "You should sit down before you fall down, Damien." She pronounced his name differently.
Softer. Familiar.
Not afraid of him at all. Damien sighed quietly like he had heard that sentence many times before.
Ia mi fine, Rosa.
That is usually how exhausted men announce they are about to faint. I accidentally smiled into my teacup. Damien looked at me immediately, catching the reaction. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched upward slightly too. The expression changed his entire face. Less dangerous. Younger somehow. Then he pressed a hand suddenly against the edge of the marble kitchen island beside him. Hard. Too hard. The color drained from his face so quickly my stomach tightened. "Damien?" He shook his head once, breathing carefully through his nose. "I am fine." "You are bleeding through your shirt." Silence. Rosa closed her eyes briefly, like this was not unusual. "I will get the medical kit," she muttered before disappearing down the hallway. Damien looked deeply annoyed with the entire situation. "You really should stop saying you are fine when you clearly are not," I said gently. His pale blue eyes lifted toward me slowly.
Tired.
Frustrated. Vulnerable in a way he probably hated. And you should stop observing people professionally when you're off the clock. Occupational hazard. Another flicker of almost smiling crossed his face. Then it vanished again as quickly as it came. Rosa returned carrying a black medical case and placed it heavily onto the marble counter. Damien immediately reached for it himself. I noticed the slight tremor in his hand before he hit it again. You should let someone help you, I said carefully. I do not need help. Everybody does sometimes. The answer slipped out softly. Honest. Something changed in Damien's expression again at those words. Not anger.
Worse.
Recognition. He looked away first. People usually ask me for things, he admitted quietly after a long silence.
Money.
Protection. Favors. He loosened the cuff of his shirt slowly, without looking at me. You are the first person in a very long time who keeps offering me help instead. Rain streaked across the massive windows behind him while thunder rolled softly over the city skyline. The entire penthouse suddenly felt too quiet around those words. That is sad, I whispered before I could stop myself. Damien froze completely. The air shifted instantly. Not dangerous. Fragile. Like I had accidentally touched something inside him nobody else ever acknowledged existed. His gaze lifted toward mine slowly. You really think I deserve pity? He asked quietly. I shook my head immediately.
No. I sua ljubav carafulli.
I think you deserve rest. For a second, Damien Moretti looked at me like those might have been the kindest words anyone had spoken to him in years. People who survive too much eventually forget they're allowed to be cared for. The storm outside softened sometime after 3 a.m, but nobody inside the penthouse seemed to notice. Manhattan glowed silver beyond the massive windows while rain slid slowly down the glass like tears the city refused to admit to. Rosa eventually disappeared upstairs after forcing Damien to drink tea and swallow pain medication with the exhausted authority of someone who had probably been taking care of him for years. That left the two of us alone in the enormous kitchen surrounded by silence and soft amber lighting. Damien sat across from me at the marble island with his dress shirt rolled halfway up his forearms. Expensive watch. Sharp hands. Faint shadows beneath pale blue eyes that looked heavier every minute. He had finally removed the black coat entirely, revealing the white shirt underneath stained faintly near his ribs where the fabric pulled tight when he moved. You should probably sleep, I said quietly, cradling the warm teacup between my hands. Damien let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I do not sleep much. Nightmares. The question slipped out before I could stop it. His eyes lifted slowly toward mine. There it was again. That looked like nobody was supposed to ask him things that personal.
But
instead of shutting down, Damien surprised me. Sometimes, he admitted softly. Mostly memories. The honesty in his voice settled heavily between us. I looked around the penthouse again. Expensive furniture. Perfectly organized bookshelves. Beautiful empty spaces that did not feel lived in. This place feels lonely, I whispered before I could filter the thought. Damien glanced toward the windows overlooking the city skyline. It is safer that way. I should have let the conversation end there. Any reasonable person would have. But nothing about tonight had been reasonable since the moment I saw him bleeding in that subway station. Safe for who? He went still. Completely still. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the quiet ticking of the luxury clock built into the far kitchen wall. Finally, Damien stood from the stool and walked slowly toward the windows. His reflection stared back at him through the rain-dark glass.
tall.
Controlled. Untouchable. But from where I sat, he looked unbearably tired. When people get close to me, he said quietly without turning around, they usually end up paying for it. The sadness in his voice hit harder than fear ever could have. I watched his reflection carefully. That sounds lonely too. He lowered his head slightly at that. The city lights painted silver across the sharp lines of his face, while thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. You keep saying things nobody says to me. Maybe nobody else notices. Damien finally turned toward me slowly. His expression had softened into something dangerous in an entirely different way now. Vulnerable.
Honest.
No, he said quietly. They notice. They are just smart enough not to say it out loud. I swallowed hard. There was no arrogance in his voice. Just truth. The terrifying kind. And yet you still brought me here, I whispered. He stared at me for several long seconds before answering. I do not know why. Something in my chest tightened painfully at the confession. Because I believed him. Damien Moretti looked like a man who trusted nobody, including himself. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned one hand against the window beside him and closed his eyes briefly.
His
breathing changed first. Sharper. Uneven. My therapist instincts immediately snapped awake. Damien? He shook his head once without opening his eyes. I am fine. But he was not. I recognized panic before people recognized it themselves sometimes. The rigid shoulders. Controlled breathing turning too fast. Fingers tightening against the glass like grounding himself physically was the only thing keeping him upright. I stood carefully from the stool. Hey, I said softly. Look at me. His eyes opened slowly. There was actual fear in them now. Not fear of me. Fear of losing control in front of me. And somehow that felt far more intimate than anything else that had happened tonight. Strong men are rarely afraid of pain. They are afraid of being seen while they are breaking. Damien's breathing turned uneven beneath the soft amber lights of the penthouse kitchen. One hand remained pressed flat against the cold glass window while the other curled tightly at his side like he was physically holding himself together through force alone. The city skyline blurred behind him in silver rain and distant thunder. For one terrifying second, he looked less like a powerful man and more like someone drowning quietly where nobody could see. Hey, I repeated gently. Stay with me. His pale blue eyes locked onto mine instantly. There was panic there now. Real panic. Raw and unguarded in a way I doubted anyone had witnessed before. I cannot. He stopped himself hard enough that his jaw tightened painfully. You can, I said softly. You are safe right now. The word safe seemed to hit him strangely, like his body did not know what to do with it anymore. Damien closed his eyes briefly, breathing too fast. I moved carefully toward him, slow enough not to overwhelm him. Trauma lived in the nervous system long after danger disappeared. People forgot that. Look at me, I whispered again once I stood a few feet away. He obeyed immediately this time. That scared me more than if he had resisted. Powerful men did not usually follow instructions. Not unless they were desperate. Can you count 5 things you see? His expression tightened slightly with confusion. Clara, please. Another. Silence stretched between us. Then finally, in a rough voice, he answered. The skyline. His breathing hitched unevenly. The piano near the stairs. Another breath. Your necklace. I glanced down instinctively at the small silver chain resting against my sweater. When I looked back up, Damien was still staring at it like grounding himself to tiny details was the only thing keeping the panic from swallowing him whole. Good, I whispered. Now 4 things you can touch. His breathing slowed slightly. Barely. The window. Another inhale. My watch. His gaze lowered briefly toward the marble counter beside him. The cold stone. Then his eyes lifted back to mine. You. My heartbeat stumbled painfully at the softness in his voice. I had not even realized he was still lightly holding the sleeve of my coat from when I stepped closer. The contact was barely there. Careful. Almost hesitant. Like he was terrified I might pull away if he touched too much. That is good, I said quietly. You are doing fine. Damien let out a shaky breath that sounded dangerously close to breaking apart entirely. I do not do this, he admitted hoarsely. I do not lose control. Panic is not weakness. For men like me, it is. The sadness in those words hit harder than anything else tonight. I looked at him standing there beneath the city lights in his expensive clothes and exhaustion and invisible scars nobody else seemed allowed to acknowledge. Suddenly, I understood something important. Damien Moretti had spent his entire life being feared. But fear was a terrible replacement for comfort.
Who taught you that?
I asked softly. His eyes closed again for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice barely rose above the rain outside. Everyone. Something inside my chest ached so sharply, I almost could not breathe. Without thinking, I reached up slowly and placed my hand gently over the one still gripping my coat sleeve. Damien froze instantly beneath my touch, not pulling away, not moving at all, just staring down at our hands together like nobody had touched him gently in a very long time. "You are allowed to rest too," I whispered.
His throat moved slightly as he
Swallowed hard. Then, for the first time since I met him, Damien Moretti looked at me with absolutely no walls left between us. Just exhaustion, grief, and a loneliness so deep it nearly shattered me to witness it. The saddest thing about broken people is how grateful they become for simple kindness. Damien did not let go of my sleeve immediately. His fingers remained lightly curled against the fabric of my coat while rain whispered softly against the enormous penthouse windows behind us. Manhattan stretched below in blurred gold and silver lights, distant and cold. But inside that kitchen, the world suddenly felt unbearably small. Just me. Just him. Just a dangerous man standing there like he had spent his entire life carrying too much alone. His breathing finally began to steady beneath my hand. Slow, controlled. Not perfect, but better. I watched the tension ease slightly from his shoulders, though exhaustion still clung to him like a second skin. "Nobody usually stays," he admitted quietly after a long silence. The honesty in his voice almost hurt to hear. "When people see what my life really looks like," he stopped himself. His pale blue eyes drifted toward the rain-dark windows instead. "They leave." Something inside me tightened painfully. I thought about the enormous empty penthouse, the bodyguards downstairs, the little boy upstairs carrying grief too big for his age, and Damien standing in the middle of all of it looking like a man who had forgotten what peace felt like. "Maybe they only saw the wrong parts of you," I whispered. He looked back at me immediately, too quickly, like those words caught him off guard. "You barely know me, Clara." "That is true." I swallowed carefully. "But I know what loneliness looks like." Silence settled softly around us again. Not uncomfortable this time, just honest. Damien's gaze lowered briefly toward our hands before he slowly released the sleeve of my coat, like he was forcing himself to let go of something dangerous. "You should hate me," he said quietly. "Most people eventually do." "Do you want me to?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. His brows pulled together slightly, as if nobody had ever asked what he wanted emotionally before. "I do not know anymore," he admitted after a long pause. My chest ached at the exhaustion in those words. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly, probably Luca moving around, unable to sleep through the storm. Damien's attention flicked instinctively toward the ceiling at the sound. Immediate concern. Automatic. I noticed that too. He caught me noticing. "He has nightmares," Damien said quietly. "Almost every night. And you stay awake with him." "Not a question." Damien looked away again. "Sometimes he falls asleep faster if he knows I am nearby." The image hit me unexpectedly hard. This feared man sitting awake through thunderstorms beside a frightened child because he understood what fear felt like too. "You love him very much," I whispered. Damien's expression softened instantly at the mention of Luca. There it was again, the hidden humanity underneath all the cold control. "He is all I have left of my brother." Grief moved through his voice like a shadow passing across water. Suddenly the exhaustion made more sense. The loneliness. The panic. Men who spent years surviving loss eventually stopped believing they deserved comfort afterward. I looked down briefly at the cooling tea forgotten beside us. "You know," I said softly, "children are not afraid of imperfect people." Damien's eyes lifted toward mine again. "They are afraid of unpredictable ones. Cold ones. Absent ones." I hesitated carefully. "But Luca looks at you like you are his safe place." For one heartbreaking second, Damien looked completely undone by that sentence. His throat tightened visibly before he looked away toward the city, lights again. "Nobody has ever called me safe before," he admitted in barely more than a whisper. The sadness in his voice nearly shattered me. I stepped closer without thinking. close enough now to see the exhaustion lining every inch of his face beneath the soft kitchen lighting. Maybe they never stayed long enough to understand you, I whispered gently. Damien stared at me in silence. Long enough for my heartbeat to become painfully loud in my own ears. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he asked the question that changed everything between us. And what happens if you stay? The most dangerous moments in life are usually the quiet ones. Damien's question stayed suspended between us while rain traced silver lines across the penthouse windows behind him. And what happens if you stay?
His voice was soft now.
Not commanding, not cold, just honest in a way that felt almost terrifying coming from a man who clearly spent most of his life hiding every vulnerable part of himself behind control. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came immediately, because the truth was I did not know. I barely knew this man. A few hours ago, he had been a stranger bleeding beneath flickering subway lights while bodyguards watched him like soldiers protecting a king. Now he stood barefoot on black marble floors at nearly 4 in the morning looking at me like I held the answer to something he had been searching for his entire life. The silence stretched between us, fragile and warm. Then suddenly, footsteps pounded quickly across the upstairs hallway. Damien turned instantly toward the staircase before Luca even appeared. Instinct. Protective instinct. The little boy hurried down the stairs, clutching the dinosaur tightly against his chest, green eyes wide with panic. The thunder woke me up, he whispered shakily. Damien crouched immediately despite the pain it clearly caused him. Hey, he said gently. You are okay. Lucas shook his head hard. I had the bad dream again. Something in Damien's expression cracked at those words. Not dramatically.
Quietly.
The kind of pain that had lived inside someone for too long. Lucas stepped closer uncertainly before looking toward me. Can Clara stay until I fall asleep? The room went completely still. Damien looked up at me slowly from where he crouched beside the little boy. There was no pressure in his eyes.
No manipulación.
Just exhaustion and hope carefully hidden beneath years of control. I should have said no. Any responsible adult would have gone home hours ago. But Luca looked terrified, and Damien looked like he had forgotten how to ask people for anything without expecting them to leave afterward. Okay, I whispered softly. Relief crossed Luca's face instantly. Damien's reaction was quieter. More dangerous somehow. His eyes lowered briefly, like he was trying not to show how much those 2 letters affected him. We settled upstairs in Luca's room nearly 20 minutes later. The space surprised me. No cold luxury.
No designer perfection.
Just soft lighting, books stacked beside the bed, faded dinosaur blankets, and hand-drawn pictures taped carefully across the walls.
Childlike. Loved.
Damien sat in the armchair near the window while Luca curled beneath the blankets beside me listening to the storm outside. Every few minutes, thunder rattled softly through the glass. Every time it did, Luca's small hand tightened around the dinosaur. And every single time, Damien looked up immediately from the chair to make sure he was okay. Tell me something good, Luca whispered sleepily after a while. I smiled faintly. Okay. I glanced toward the rain outside. When storms happen, trees actually grow stronger roots afterward because they have to hold themselves steady against the wind. Luca considered that carefully. So storms can make things stronger? Sometimes, I whispered. If they survive them. The room fell quiet again. Luca's breathing slowly deepened against the pillow as exhaustion finally pulled him toward sleep. I looked up eventually and realized Damien was watching me instead of the storm now. Not intensely. Not possessively. Just quietly. Like he could not understand why someone would sit in the middle of the night comforting a frightened child that did not belong to them. You are very gentle with him, he said softly once Luca finally drifted asleep. I looked down at the sleeping little boy curled beside the dinosaur blanket. Children remember gentleness longer than people realize. Damien stared at me for several silent seconds after that. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he whispered words that made my chest ache instantly. I do not think anyone was ever gentle with me. There are some confessions so quiet they change everything anyway. Damien's words lingered in the darkened bedroom long after the storm softened outside. I do not think anyone was ever gentle with me.
Luca slept.
Peacefully beside me beneath dinosaur blankets, while the city glowed faintly beyond the tall windows. The entire room smelled like rain, chamomile tea, and the faint cedar scent that seemed to follow Damien everywhere. I looked toward him sitting silently in the armchair near the window. The dangerous aura was still there. It probably always would be. But tonight I had also seen panic attacks, sleeplessness, grief, and a man who stayed awake through thunderstorms because a frightened child needed him nearby. Human beings were complicated like that. Sometimes the scariest people carried the deepest wounds. You deserved better than that, I whispered softly. Damien looked at me immediately. The sadness in his eyes almost physically hurt to witness now that I knew how carefully he hid it from everyone else. You say things like they are simple. Some things are. I adjusted the blanket carefully over Luca's shoulder. Children need safety. People need kindness. None of that is complicated. Damien leaned his head back slowly against the chair, exhaustion pulling visibly at every line of his face. In my world, he said quietly, kindness is usually mistaken for weakness. Maybe your world is wrong. One corner of his mouth twitched faintly at that. Not amusement, exactly. More disbelief that someone would dare say such a thing to him out loud. Silence settled between us again while rain tapped gently against the windows. For the first time all night, the storm no longer sounded angry, just tired. Like the city itself was finally exhaling after hours of holding tension too tightly. Damien watched Luca sleeping for a long moment before speaking again. He used to laugh constantly before his parents died. The grief in his voice settled heavily into the room. Now he barely speaks unless he absolutely has to. Trauma changes children, I said softly. But they can heal if they feel safe long enough. Damien lowered his eyes briefly. And adults? The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, because he sounded hopeful asking it. Careful hope. The kind people carry only after being disappointed too many times before. I studied him quietly beneath the dim bedroom lighting. The expensive shirt rolled at the sleeves. The shadows beneath his pale blue eyes. The exhaustion he carried like armor. Adults can heal too, I whispered. It just takes longer because adults spend years pretending they do not need help. He looked away immediately after that, like the words landed too close to something vulnerable inside him. A few minutes later, Luca shifted sleepily beneath the blankets and mumbled something unintelligible before settling again. Instinctively, Damien stood from the chair and walked over to the bed. His movements were careful despite the pain he still tried hiding near his ribs. He adjusted the dinosaur blanket gently around Luca's shoulders without waking him. The tenderness in that small gesture nearly broke my heart completely. Damien noticed me watching him. What? He asked quietly. I shook my head slowly. Nothing. But it was not nothing. It was everything. Because men who enjoyed cruelty did not tuck frightened children safely beneath blankets at 4 a.m. Men who were truly heartless did not look at grieving little boys like they would burn the world down just to protect what remained of their family. Damien straightened slowly beside the bed. You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve something.
His voice was softer now.
Tired. Honest. I hesitated before answering carefully. I think I am trying to understand how someone so feared can also look so sad. The room went still again. Completely still. Damien stared at me for several long seconds before lowering his gaze toward Luca sleeping peacefully between us. Then, in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the rain, he admitted the one thing I knew cost him more than any confession tonight. Because fear is easier than being loved. The hardest people to love are usually the ones who believe they are impossible to love at all. Damien's words lingered in the dim bedroom long after he spoke them. Fear is easier than being loved. Rain drifted softly against the windows now, quieter than before, like the storm itself had finally grown tired. Luca slept peacefully between us beneath the dinosaur blankets, one small hand still curled tightly around the stuffed toy. For the first time all night, the little boy looked completely safe. I glanced toward Damien standing beside the bed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical pain now. emotionally exhausted. Like every wall he had spent years building was suddenly too heavy to keep holding upright around me. Easier does not mean better, I whispered softly. His pale blue eyes lifted toward mine immediately. There was something fragile in them now. Not weakness. Just honesty stripped bare. Damien looked like a man who had survived his entire life by controlling every room he entered. But tonight, standing in the quiet beside a sleeping child, he looked almost lost. You make everything sound simple, he murmured. It is simple. I stepped carefully away from the bed, so we would not wake Luca. People are just complicated when they are afraid. Damien followed me silently out into the upstairs hallway, where warm golden lights glowed softly against dark wood floors. The penthouse felt different now in the quiet hours before dawn. Less intimidating, more human somehow. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly 4 times. Damien leaned briefly against the hallway wall like exhaustion was finally catching up to him completely. You should sleep, I said gently. He let out a tired breath. I would not know how. Something about the honesty in his voice made my chest ache again. When was the last time you actually rested? He gave me a look that answered the question before he even spoke. I do not remember. That was not normal. It was not healthy either. I had spent years working with trauma survivors, and one thing became obvious quickly. Human beings could survive almost anything temporarily. But eventually the nervous system always collected its debt. Damien had been surviving for so long that he no longer knew how to stop. We walked slowly downstairs together while the city outside remained dark and rain-soaked. The massive penthouse no longer felt cold to me now that I understood the loneliness hiding inside it. Damien paused near the kitchen window overlooking Manhattan. Most people are uncomfortable around silence, he said quietly. You're not. I leaned lightly against the marble counter beside him. Silence tells you things if you listen long enough. One corner of his mouth lifted faintly. And what is this silence telling you? I looked toward him carefully. That you are tired of pretending you are okay. The small, almost smile disappeared instantly. Not because he was angry, because I was right. Damien stared out at the skyline for a long moment before speaking again. My brother used to say something similar. The grief in his voice softened everything sharp about him immediately. What happened to him?
Silence. Heavy this time.
Painful. Damien's jaw tightened slightly before he answered in barely more than a whisper. I could not protect him. The confession settled heavily between us. I suddenly understood something important. Damien did not carry control because he enjoyed power. He carried it because somewhere deep inside him still lived a man terrified of losing people he loved again. That was not your fault, I said softly. He shook his head immediately. You do not know that. The sadness in his voice nearly broke me. Before I could answer, Damien's phone vibrated sharply against the marble counter between us. The atmosphere changed instantly. Every wall slammed back into place around him in seconds. His expression hardened. Controlled. Dangerous again. I watched him read the message on the screen while tension slowly pulled across his shoulders. What is it? I asked quietly. Damien locked the phone without answering immediately. Then he looked at me with an expression that made my stomach tighten painfully.
Fear.
Not for himself.
For me.
Clara, he said softly. I think you need to leave before sunrise. Sometimes the people who want to protect you the most are the same people you should run from. Damien's words settled heavily into the quiet kitchen. I think you need to leave before sunrise. The softness in his voice scared me more than if he had shouted. Because fear looked unnatural on a man like him. Especially fear for someone else. Rain still drifted quietly against the windows, overlooking Manhattan while dawn threatened the horizon in faint shades of gray and blue. I stared at Damien across the marble counter, trying to understand how the same man who terrified an entire subway station hours ago now looked haunted by the idea of me staying too long near him. What happened? I asked softly. Damien slid the phone into his pocket without answering immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, while every wall I had spent the night watching crack apart slowly rebuilt themselves around him. Controlled, careful, untouchable again. But not completely. I could still see the exhaustion underneath it now. Someone saw you with me tonight, he admitted quietly. That makes you visible. The words sent a chill down my spine despite the warmth inside the penthouse. Visible to who? His pale blue eyes met mine. People who use weakness against men like me. Silence filled the room instantly. Somewhere upstairs, Luca slept peacefully, unaware that the fragile safety of this night was already disappearing with the approaching sunrise. Damien looked away first. You should never have gotten into that car. The regret in his voice hurt more than it should have. I made that choice. You did not understand what you were stepping into. Then explain it to me. My voice came out quieter than intended. Damien went still. Completely still. The city lights reflected faintly across his face, while dawn slowly crept closer beyond the windows. Clara, he said carefully, there are parts of my life that ruin people simply for standing too close to them. And yet Lucas still needs you. The answer slipped out instantly.
Honest.
Damien closed his eyes briefly at that. Like the mention of the little boy physically hurt him somehow. Luca is family. And family is worth protecting. His eyes opened slowly again. Tired.
Sat.
Exactly. For a second neither of us moved. Then Damien stepped closer to me around the kitchen island. Not threatening. Never threatening with me. Just close enough now that I could see faint silver strands hidden in his dark hair beneath the soft morning light. Stress. Sleepless nights. Too many years carrying too much alone. You are kind, he said quietly. Do not let men like me take that away from you. Something inside my chest tightened painfully at the way he said it. Like he had already decided he did not deserve to keep anything gentle in his life for long. Maybe you do not get to decide what kind of person I become around you, I whispered. Damien stared at me like those words reached somewhere dangerous inside him. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear both of us breathing. Then suddenly, footsteps echoed softly from the hallway upstairs. Luca appeared at the top of the staircase, rubbing sleep from his green eyes, dinosaur still tucked beneath one arm. Clara, he mumbled sleepily. Are you leaving? Damien looked up at the little boy instantly. Something changed in his face right then. Not weakness.
Clarity.
Like Luca's voice reminded him what mattered most. He turned back toward me slowly. Rosa will have a driver take you home safely. His voice had become controlled again, but the sadness beneath it remained impossible to hide now that I knew where to look. I swallowed hard against the ache building in my chest. And what if I do not want this to be goodbye? The question escaped before I could stop it. Damien's expression broke in the smallest, quietest way. Like hope itself frightened him more than danger ever had. He stepped closer one final time until only inches separated us beneath the soft glow of the kitchen lights. Then, in a voice rough with exhaustion and something painfully close to longing, Damien whispered the words I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. Clara, people like me do not get happy endings.